Okay, let's talk about the first theorist on that list, Albert Rice. Albert Rice wrote an article in 1951 that most people use to kind of plant him in the field of social control theorists. And what Rice wrote about in 1951 had to do with the role of parents in establishing bonds with their children and having that be a source of control for children. So, first of all, Rice kind of firmly plants himself in control by stating at the outset, at the very beginning of his article, that delinquency, his explanation for why young boys get into crime, which, in adolescence we call delinquency. Delinquency is due to a failure of restraint of personal and social controls. So you have to keep this in perspective. He was writing this at a time period where people had started to write papers about things like strain theory. People had started to explore things like learning theory. Rice wanted to completely separate himself from that and say, no, we don't commit crime because we're pressured into it or we learn how to do it. We commit crime when we're no longer restrained from doing so. So delinquency for him is when you're no longer restrained by things like personal and social controls in your life. And Rice believed that the people most responsible for establishing someone's personal and social controls are their parents. So, parents being able to establish a strong bond with their children is the most important thing, according to Rice. It's all about parental bonds. And if a parent can strongly bond to their child, that's going to protect and control that child from committing crime. So, for them, this was all about parents building a strong attachment to their children and having their children develop an attachment back to them. According to him, if this strong attachment exists, you're going to have a strong sense of control. Children are going to feel like they don't want to let their parents down because they respect them, they love them, they want to be just like them, they're attached to them. So, according to him, this parental bond is really critical. Not only does it matter because of the attachment that gets formed, but according to him, this is also how children develop their morals, moral values, and conscience and things like that all come from, according to Rice, attachment to your parents. So it's actually a fairly simple explanation of why somebody starts to commit crime. According to him, if you don't have this strong parental bond to your parents as a child early in life, you're going to be very likely to get into trouble as a juvenile, as an adolescent. So for him, weak parental bonding is really the primary cause of delinquency. So he's really putting a lot of onus, a lot of responsibility on early parenting in terms of what's going to set a child up for either success or failure later on in their life. And for him, the reason why parental bonding matters is it teaches children to attach and to care and be invested in things that are pro social. And he's really the first one to kind of formally state this in criminology, the first one to really break free from the ideas of strain theory, the ideas of learning theory, and say, no, if you don't if you don't restrain and control and teach kids, they're going to commit crime. They're going to be violent. They're going to take what they want when they want it. You have to teach a child to conform. A child does not conform naturally. So again, Rice kind of puts his line in the sand and really puts the majority of the responsibility in terms of preventing delinquency and crime on parents, on the bonds the parents establish with their children. The next person that most people cite as being extremely influential in control theory is a sociologist by the name of Jackson Tobey. And he wrote in a little bit later in the 1950s, again, firmly planting himself in the ideas of individual level control theory. And the reason for that is his major contribution had to do with a phrase that came to be highly associated with his work, which was describing a person's stake in conformity. Now, for Jackson Tobey, he kind of starts out in his first paper about this in 1957 by taking a slightly unique, I think, take on crime and motivation for crime. And basically, what he said was the impulses and the motivations to commit crime aren't really that surprising. They're universal, they don't need much explanation. It makes sense that when we see something that we want, we're going to try to get it. If something makes us mad, we're going to try to alleviate that anger. In other words, the impulses and motivations that often come before someone committing crime are things that everyone experiences. Almost all of us, at some period, at some time point in our life, experience impulses to do things that are going to satisfy and please us. So for him, trying to explain criminal activity by describing, super predators, evil people. He didn't really believe in that. He thought that for the most part we all have these kind of impulses kind of running under the surface of us. It's our ability to check them and control them which he was interested in. And for him, impulses are checked by a person's stake in conformity. Your stake in conformity is what's going to be important to control and restrain you, to control your impulses, control your motivations. So for him, he defined someone's stake in conformity as the extent to which a person has something to lose by deviance, by committing crime. If you have a low stake in conformity, if you don't have a lot in the pro-social, non-criminal world really to live for, to be invested in, you're not going to have a lot to lose. So committing crime is going to be more more feasible to you. So for him, a person's stake in conformity is something that he thought was extremely important. And this is kind of his way to differentiate individual level control theory from universal, from neighborhood level control theory, because he really looked at some of the work that was getting done in Chicago at the time, examining different crime levels in different neighborhoods, and he made the observation that, well, just because one neighborhood has high crime doesn't mean everyone in that neighborhood is committing crime. There are usually only a few people within a neighborhood who are committing a lot of the crime. So why is that? Why is it that not everyone in a neighborhood where the odds are stacked against them becomes deviant? And for him, he explained that by saying that everybody has different levels of stakes in conformity. People that grow up and don't have a lot of things to bond to form attachments to, they're not going to have a stake in kind of normal society. They're not going to have a lot to lose if they commit crime. So for him, that was really a way for him to separate himself and the individual level theories from the ideas in social disorganization. He thought that was a good start, and he agreed with a lot of the ideas behind it. But for him, explaining crime by explaining people's stake in conformity could separate these kind of control theories from neighborhood level explanations. For him, social control theory, individual level control theory, explains why, even in a bad neighborhood, only some people within it are the ones committing most of the crime. All of you can probably think of things that you would consider your stakes in conformity, things that you would have to lose if you committed crime. Maybe some of you are here on an academic scholarship, so committing crimes, committing especially academic crimes, might put that in jeopardy. That's a stake in conformity that you might not be willing to lose by committing crime. So that's the kind of idea that he was talking about. And you can see how it's similar to the ideas in Rice, but for him he's really not really talking about parrots so much specifically. For him, anything that gives you a stake in conformity can be a controlling influence. All right, and the third and final person that makes up what we call kind of the early social control theorists is a sociologist named Walter Reckless. And he was someone who wrote several works in the 1960s developing what he called containment theory. And this is just another example of an early social control theory. So he called it containment theory, but you can kind of think of it as being part of this larger body of work. So Walter Reckless, again, started out by putting his line in the sand in terms of establishing himself as a control theorist. And one of the first things Walter Reckless stated in some of his works was that people have various types of social controls, socially controlling forces in their life that help them resist crime. And he called those social controls containments. We all have different things that contain us, that help us resist crime. So for him, calling it containment theory was just another way of describing social control. And he extended this idea by saying that there are different types of these containments. There are different types of social controls. One type that he described were things that he called inner containments. And for him, this was people's morals, the values that they have slowly accumulated and accrued over their life. And they could be taught by parents, teachers, peers, any number of places you can get them from. But the point is, over time, they become something that you yourself, you can consider you controlling yourself by establishing morals and values. So we are all, according to him, at least on some level, contained by our conscience, by values and morals that we have built up and believe in over time. So that's inner containment. And he also believed that outer containment was an equally contributing force, an equally important form of social control. For him, outer containment has to do with controlling forces that you feel from your parents, from your teachers, from the police, any kind of outside force that you factor into whether or not you're going to commit crime. So, not wanting to commit crime because because you fear the wrath of your parents, or you fear punishment from teachers, or you fear getting caught by the police. All of those are examples of things that are forces kind of on the outside of yourself that control you socially, control you, allow you to conform, help you to resist crime. And again, this is actually, when you think about it, a fairly simple explanation for criminal behavior, because for him, people who have weak containments are the people who are most likely to be delinquent. If you never really establish strong morals, strong values over time, or if you don't really care about getting caught and punished by your parents or by your teachers, you don't care what people on the outside think about what you do, that's going to free you to commit crime. If you don't care about the consequences and what it's going to do to you socially, you're more likely to be someone who's going to be committing crime. So, all three of these early writers wrote pieces that were extremely popular and extremely influential. And all three of them wrote things that were kind of the beginning underpinnings of what would be a larger theory later. And I say that because while all three of them wrote about things that sound a lot like control theory, a lot of the things that they're talking about here are really hard to actually quantify and measure. Trying to actually figure out what it means to be an inner containment, or what a state in conformity actually is, how we're going to measure that, wasn't something that these theorists really spent a lot of time worrying about. They were kind of the people developing the early ideas here. And many of these people, Rice, Tobey, Reckless, had graduate students who really embraced the ideas that they were publishing and later on developed what would become some important themes and some important issues in social control theory. Okay, so one of the most prominent people who took the ideas of social control theory and really formed one of the most famous and highly researched and referenced area in criminology is a criminologist by the name of Travis Hirschi. Now, Travis Hirschi was a PhD candidate in the late 1960s from University of California, Berkeley, and he wrote his PhD dissertation in 1969, and it became a book. He wrote his dissertation, basically became a book called Causes of Delinquency. And this is essentially one of now the most famous books in the field of criminology, because not only did he kind of form and establish a new theory in it, but he also tested the theory with data and published the results, all in this one book. So, I think you'll see in his theory how closely he is following up on and formalizing the ideas of some of those first theorists that we learned about. So, in Causes of Delinquency, in this book, Travis Hirschi, again, firmly plants himself in the field of social control by stating that delinquency for him happens when a person's bonds to society are weakened or broken, really. So in other words, he's definitely establishing himself as a control theorist, because he's saying that the only way people could commit crime is when their bonds are weakened. In the absence of control, that's when a person commits crime. Again, this should be something that's familiar at this point. So for him, conformity happens because people are afraid of hurting and disrupting those social bonds. You conform because you don't want to disrupt, break, hurt relationships with people like your family, your friends, your job. So for him, we conform because we have strong social bonds. People who don't commit crime aren't doing so because they have learned to do it that way or because they are not experiencing stresses or strains. Most people don't commit crime because they've developed things to bond to and care about and be attached to that they don't want to risk losing. So in other words, he's taking these ideas, social bonds and stakes in conformity, and kind of formalizing it into what he called a theory of social bonds. So some people call it social control theory. Hershey called it his theory of social bonds. And again, what really separates out, the reason why we talk about him slightly separately from those first three theorists is not only did he talk about these ideas and clarify them, but he tested this theory with data, which is something that those first three authors didn't really do. So he established the theory, showed how different it was from the strain and the learning ideas, clarified the concepts in it, actually tried to define social bonds in a way that we could measure them, and then he tested his theory. I mean, this was his dissertation, so part of it was collecting data and doing research and trying to prove his hypotheses to be true. And that's what this book, Causes of Delinquency, was. Not only did it explain his theory, but it showed his results when he tested his theory. So what Hershey did in his theory, in this social bonds theory, was he tested the theory using data that he collected from urban California high schools. So he asked, basically what he did is he took a general population of kids from high schools in urban areas in California, and he asked them in survey form series of questions that were all designed to test how bonded they were, to test their level of social bonds. So before you can do this, though, you have to understand how he actually defined the social bond, what it means to be socially bonded. And for Hershey, he decided that there are four main elements that make up a person's social bond, and they're not completely separate from each other, but he designed questions in his survey to try to assess people's levels of each of these four elements. So the first element is a person's attachment to society. And I put an asterisk after attachment here because Hershey really believed that this was the most important element of a person's social bond, how attached they are. And to do that, to assess people's attachment, basically what he was assuming here is that the bond and affection and care that you have for your parents, for your school, for your friends, all of those things act as major deterrents for crime. So the stronger your attachment is to things like that, the more likely it should be that you take them into account and don't commit crime. So Hershey asked the students in his survey questions like, do you want to be the kind of person your father is when you grow up? Do you talk to your parents a lot? Do you like school? Do you care what your teachers think about you? Do you admire your friends? All of those questions and their responses to them were things that he believed could assess a person's attachment to different elements of society. The second element is a person's commitment to society. So basically what he meant by commitment is how committed you are to pro-social goals. So he would ask, again, these are high school students, so he would ask them questions like, how important is having a car to you? How important is it for you to graduate from high school? How important is it for you to go to college? He was trying to assess how committed they were to kind of following a normal, healthy, for him, pro-social, non-criminal lifestyle. How committed are you to living a non-criminal lifestyle? And again, students that scored very highly on this, he would assume, would be less likely to also report committing a lot of delinquent criminal acts. The third element was a person's involvement in terms of involvement in non-criminal activities. So the idea here is if you're highly involved in non-criminal activities, Hershey thinks that this would act as a control because you literally do not have time to be deviant. So if you think about it, if those for those of you who in high school played on a sports team, maybe also played a musical instrument, maybe volunteered sometimes, for those of you who had a lot of activities, he would say that that protected you from committing crime, not necessarily just because you were attached and committed to them, but because you literally were so involved in normal activities that you didn't have idle time to get into trouble. So he would ask students questions like, how much time do you spend on homework? Do you often feel like there's nothing to do? And students who reported spending more time in pro-social activities and less time reported being idle and just hanging around, he would expect to commit less crime. Think about how different these ideas are from the ideas of strain theory, for example. In strain theory, when you think about it, commitment to conventional goals is thought to propel you into crime because you experience strain from wanting to achieve your goals. But in control theory, it's really the exact opposite. Commitment to conventional goals is viewed as a constraint, a control, because delinquency would be seen as jeopardizing those goals. So again, it's a very different idea, and he made it very clear in his book that this is a very, very different explanation for criminal behavior. And the final element of the social bond for him was a person's belief. And basically, he would ask questions to assess a person's values that are pro-social, assess their morals. This was, for example, one of the questions that he asked. Do you have a lot of respect for your local police department? Is it okay to get around the law if you can get away with it? He would ask them all these questions to kind of assess their value system. And essentially, the idea was that students who scored very highly, in other words, believing and being invested in kind of pro-social, non-criminal morals and values, he thought that those students would also be the ones that were least likely to report deviant criminal activity. So he asked these students all of these different types of questions to try to assess how socially bonded they were by all these different types of attachments. And he found success with his results, especially with regard to attachment to parents. He really found that element of the social bond seemed to be the one that was the most important in terms of protecting and constraining people from committing crime. Children who reported caring a lot what their parents thought about them, being, respecting their parents, wanting to be just like their parents. Kids who scored really highly on that were the kids who reported the least amount of criminal activity. So for him, people who scored the lowest on those kind of attachment scales, people who had low attachment, were really the ones that were the most likely to report deviant and criminal activity. So for him, he really strongly supported this theory that he had designed, because on all of these levels, especially with attachment, but on all four elements of the social bond, students that scored the lowest on all four of those elements were also the people that were committing the most crime. Again, Hershey's theory was incredibly influential, incredibly popular, and because he was successful with his first attempt to test it with data, the theory really took off after him and people started testing it much more. One area that Hershey got a lot of attention on, and an area that has received a lot of research since Hershey, is what Hershey had to say about the role of your peers in your criminal activity. So essentially the idea here is, do you commit crime because you're influenced by criminal friends, or did you start being friends with people who committed crime because they're similar to you? So for Hershey, his explanation of the relationship between peers and crime is the fact that boys who have similar levels of social bonds are going to become friends with each other. In other words, he kind of adopted this idea that birds of a feather flock together. It's not that you come together and get influenced by your friends, it's that you became friends with people who are on a similar level with you. And the crime that you experience after that isn't necessarily a consequence of your friends, it's a consequence of all of your social bonds and how low they are. So for him, delinquent peers, forming into delinquent peer groups, is a consequence of poor social bonds, not a cause. Your peers don't make you or elevate your level of criminal activity, but you just tend to associate with people who are like you. And kids who have not formed strong social attachments to kind of normal activities are going to gravitate towards each other. So this is, I mean, think how different this is, his explanation of the relationship between peers and crime. Think how different this is from the ideas in social learning theory. I mean, he's really saying that the exact opposite is true. We know that most boys, most youths who commit crime in groups. And what Hershey is saying is the fact that they get together and commit crime in groups is just evidence of the fact that they all had similar levels of attachment to society, and they happened to join up and become friends probably because of that. So Hershey's theory has undergone a lot of tests and critiques over the past 30 or so years. I mean, from 1970 to the 1990s, the theory was really frequently tested. And there's some overall kind of conclusions and critiques you should be aware of. Well, first of all, in terms of conclusions, most research has been fairly supportive of it. People have studied it in urban settings and rural settings, and overall, most people have been able to find that yes, people who seem to measure low on these attachment scales, on these social bonding scales, are people that are more likely to commit crime. So, in terms of overall conclusions, overall there is support for Hershey's theory. But there are some questions and problems that are still being raised with it. Probably one of the biggest critiques of Hershey's theory is the fact that it really can only explain a very small percentage of the variance of behavior. So whenever you're trying to explain, you're trying to come up with an explanation of crime, think about it this way. If you have a pie chart and you're trying to explain 100% of a person's behavior, if you can only explain about 2% of it, of a person's behavior, with this theory of crime, you're really not telling the whole story. So one of the critiques is there must be something else going on in people's lives other than just how bonded they are. That can't be the only thing that matters because it doesn't seem to explain the majority of the person's behavior. Another problem with this theory is the fact that these four elements of the social bond, attachment, involvement, commitment, and belief, everybody kind of measured them their own way. So they took Hershey's theory and they measured it and they tried to replicate it, but they didn't always measure it the same way that he did. So one of the critiques of the research that followed Hershey's is you can't really be sure if they actually are proving his theory to be correct if they're measuring it any way they want to. And similar to Hershey, while all of the social bond elements have at least been tried to be measured, again, it really seems like attachment is the most important one. Most people who measure a person's attachment to prosocial activities, to family, to peers, people who score high on attachment are the people who tend to score lowest in terms of crime and delinquency. But the fact that the other three elements of the social bond don't really matter that much is a critique of the theory. Here's these four things that Hershey says matters. We can only find support for one of them. What's interesting about his theory is after Hershey wrote his dissertation, after he wrote that first book, Causes of Delinquency, he really didn't follow it up by doing a lot of the follow-up research himself. In other words, he kind of put this theory out there and then other people took it and tested it over a couple decades. And the reason for that is, starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Hershey really started going in another direction with control theory. And he ended up basically abandoning this theory that he had created to develop a new form of control theory, which is the next part of this lecture.